In this chapter we're going to look at what I call the option panel, and this is the area that we have down here. And you can see we've got two main areas. We've got soft selection and we've got selection modes here. And then we've got a button here called options, and that opens up a sub panel which you can see here. And this actually replicates some of the options that we saw earlier in advanced options. So you can see we've got bitmap options here. Use custom bitmap size, width, height, tile bitmap, how many tiles, and the brightness. And that copies a lot of the parameters from here, the different options that you have here. Then you've got viewport options, constant update. In other words, if you edit any of the UVs in here, it doesn't cause the viewport to update in real time. On older machines, having real-time update could cause problems because obviously the machine didn't have the power to actually do that. On current machines, it's not really that much of an option, so generally I leave constant update on. And then you've got unwrap editor options. You've got center pixel snap, weld threshold, which is used by the weld tool, which is pretty important, and so on. Now, there's one thing I don't like about the design, and that's because you have this panel here, and it really would be great if this could be made into, let's say, a panel which was over here and used up this space a little bit better, because generally you want to keep this editor square. That's the way I tend to use it anyway, and I always find that this panel takes up a little bit too much space at the bottom of the screen. But anyway, that's just a minor gripe. So let's have a look at the different options that we have up here in soft selection. So when you're working with the UVs, when you're translating them and so on, rotating them and whatever, you may want to have a soft fall off to your selection, and this is where these tools come in, obviously. So in the viewport, I'll just select the top of the spout here, and let's say now we wanted to have a soft fall off going down towards the bottom. I've turned on soft selection, and I can now move these vertices, and as you can see we have a soft selection going on here, as you can see. So I can just select these here. So you can see we've got the soft selection going on. Now there are a number of things that control that soft selection. It should be pretty much familiar to you if you're used to the edit poly tools and the edit mesh tools. The way soft selection works there, it's pretty much the same kind of system. If you are selecting vertices inside an area here and you don't want them to go over into another patch, then you can have edge distance turned on, and that will then mean that the soft selection won't leap from one patch to another. It's just like having a piece of geometry in the soft selection jumping across space to nearby polys. That can cause problems with soft selections when you're modeling, and it's the same case with UVs. So I've got edge distance turned on at the moment, and that means that if I select some vertices in this patch, and you can see you've got a patch here and you've got a seam along here. Now if I move this, you can see that the soft selection stops when it gets to the seam here. It doesn't cross over the seam. If I turn off edge distance and do the same thing, you can see now that the soft selection actually goes across the seam. So generally you'll probably want to have edge distance turned on, and that actually controls how far the edge distance is. You then have how large your selection is, and by default it uses XY space, so I'm assuming that's using world space. But it isn't necessarily that intuitive. It depends really whether you're working in the viewport and you want to base your the size of your selection on the viewport, or if you want to base it in the UV editor. If you're working in the UV editor, then it's a better idea to switch over to using UVs, and now you can change this fall off value to be something which is a little bit more intuitive. You know that if you use a value of 1, it's going to select all the way from here to over here. If we use a point value of 0.5, then it's going to be here. So we get a better idea of how large our selection is going to be. So if I did say 0.5, you can see now it should go from here all the way to the edge. Pretty much, as you can see, it falls off almost totally by the edge. And if I did half of that, now it should run out basically after 1/4 of the way across here. So as you can see, that's working intuitively. If you change over to XY, then you have to use much larger values. As you can see, as I'm scrolling out, these pixels are lighting up. You can see the soft selection's getting larger and larger. So as I said, that's in world space, so you have to think in world space. When you're using UV, you have to start thinking in UV space. which, as I said, is a little bit more practical, I think, when you're working inside the editor here. You can see what you're doing. So as an example, we could select this top edge. I could set a value here of 1, and I know that the fall off will run all the way down to here. So if I do that, as you can see, it runs all the way down to the bottom. So that's very intuitive. Now, the way the soft selection falls off is based on these values here. You can have a linear fall off, as you can see here. Let me just change the size of this fall off here because it's very large now. 0.33 should be better. There you are. So that's a linear fall off. You can have a soft fall off. So this is just controlling the kind of curve that you have. As you can see now, you get more of a sort of bell curve effect. You can have a slow fall off, and you can have a fast fall off. So this will create a kind of pinch effect. So those are the soft selection tools. Next we have the selection modes in this area here, and the three main buttons, as we covered earlier in the DVD, and they correspond to these sub-selections here, are the vertex sub-selection, the edge, and the face. And obviously, depending on which one of those is active, has quite a big impact on the kind of tools that are available to you. Now, for instance, if we're working with faces and we turn on select element, this works in a slightly different way to the way it does in the rest of Max. An element in the UV editor isn't necessarily a part of the mesh. What it is it's a patch. So in other words, it's a patch with a boundary around it, and that boundary is defined by the seams. So if I select here, you can see it's selecting this area here, and if I click here, it's selecting this area, and I can click here. So this is quite useful when you've got so, you know, I could create another little boundary here. Now if I do select element, as you can see, it's only selecting within these seams. So you can see that actually defines what an element is. So I'll just undo that a few times to put it back where it was. So select element's very useful in certain circumstances. It works, as you can see, in all the modes. We can just select edges and it'll just select all the edges in the element. Vertices, it'll select all the vertices in the element. Faces, it'll select all the faces in the element. Obviously you need to remember to turn that off if you want to make finer selections. If you select some faces, let's say, and you want to grow them, you can use the grow and shrink buttons here. So that will grow, as you can see. That's pretty intuitive. And shrink works in pretty much the same way as you'd expect in the other parts of Max. So you can grow, and then you can shrink your selection down. As you can see, you have a new brush selection mode, which is really cool. So you can just brush across faces and select them in that way, which might be useful in certain circumstances. Very nice way to make organic selections very quickly. And you've got buttons here to increase and decrease the brush selection size. Now I've checked those out. Now you'll actually see what the problem is here. There's the size of our brush selection at the moment. If I go down here, I can grow it by clicking on this button, but you can't actually see what you're doing until you go back up here. Then you can actually see how big it is. Go back down here, go back up here. Now by default there isn't actually a keyboard shortcut for that, so I'd probably recommend, if you're going to use this tool a lot, to actually set up your own keyboard shortcut for paintbrush grow and paintbrush shrink. Otherwise really you're kind of working blind, and you really want to be able to see that size changing interactively as you click on those buttons. The next option is edge loop, and that only works with edges. So we'll just turn off brush selection, and that works in the same way as you would expect with the editable poly tools. You can click on edge loop and it'll select all the edges in a row, as you can see. So again, that's pretty intuitive. Next we have rotation tools. If I make a selection, let's say I select these faces here, I can rotate them through 90 degrees on positive, or I can make a negative 90-degree rotation. As you can see, it's pulling the UVs around with it, and you can go back in the opposite direction. So you can make a rotation any way you want there. So that's very useful if you very quickly want to, take a block of UVs like this and very quickly rotate it. So that's pretty cool. And then the last button in this area, as I said, is the options button. That opens up this options area here. And these, as I said, are basically repetitions of the options that you find up here in advanced options. And the reason why they're put down here is that they're used very commonly while you're working. And that means that they've been put onto this panel so you can very quickly access them and make adjustments. For instance, the weld threshold is adjusted a lot. And it could even be argued with something like the weld threshold, because it's used so frequently, that you could actually put it up here in some sort of space up here. But anyway, this is where it resides at the moment. So those are the options in the options panel. You've got your soft selection, you've got your selection modes, which you'll be using a great deal when you're using this editor. You've got fast rotation modes here, plus 90 degrees and negative 90 degrees. And then you can open up the commonly used options, and you can tweak those as you're working. Okay, so that's it for this chapter. In the next couple of chapters, we're going to go back up here to have a look at some of the tools that we very briefly looked at earlier on in the DVD. And I wanted to come back to them later in the DVD, because there are a couple that actually need a little bit more explanation than I had time for in that particular chapter. So in the next chapter, we're going to look at the stitching and the relaxing tools. And in the chapter that follows on from that, we're going to look at the mapping tools. These are a little bit more complex, and as I said, they need a little bit more time to explain those fully. So let's move on now and have a look at the stitching and relaxing tools.